The sandwich felt heavier in Ben Carter's hands than it should have. His last one. Tommy would be hungry after the swings, but the little girl on the weathered park bench looked like she hadn't eaten in days. 8 years old? Maybe 9. Designer dress wrinkled beyond recognition. Shoes that once cost more than Ben's weekly grocery budget, now scuffed and dirty. Her small fingers pressed against her stomach as autumn wind whipped through Lincoln Park. "I'm hungry," she said, and something in those 2 words made Ben's chest tighten. Not a whine, not a demand, a quiet surrender that belonged to no child. He tore the peanut butter sandwich in half, watching her accept the larger piece like it was made of gold. Her eyes, startling blue against pale skin, held secrets that didn't belong to someone so young. What Ben didn't know, as he watched this stranger's daughter eat his son's lunch, was that he'd just shared a meal with one of the wealthiest children in Iowa. 3 years had carved deep lines around Ben's eyes, the kind that came from sleepless nights and morning coffee that never quite worked. The Honda Civic's engine coughed as he pulled into Lincoln Park, the same routine that had become his anchor since Rebecca walked out their front door with nothing but a suitcase and promises she couldn't keep. Tommy unbuckled his seatbelt before the car fully stopped. 6 years of boundless energy contained in denim overalls and grass-stained sneakers. The park stretched before them like a pocket of peace in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where everybody knew everybody's business except when it mattered most. Ben watched his son race toward the swing set, lunch bag forgotten on the passenger seat. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke, mixing with the metallic tang of playground equipment that had seen too many seasons. He grabbed the brown paper bag, its corners soft from repeated folding, and followed Tommy's path across the yellowing grass. The park was nearly empty except for a few joggers and an elderly man feeding pigeons near the pond. That's when he saw her. Small frame hunched forward on the far bench, designer clothing that screamed money but whispered neglect. Her blonde hair caught the late afternoon sun, but her posture spoke of shadows Ben recognized all too well. She sat perfectly still, watching Tommy claim his favorite swing with the determined focus of someone much older. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers occasionally pressing against her stomach in a gesture so subtle Ben almost missed it. The distance between them closed before Ben realized he was walking toward her. Something about the way she held herself, the careful composure that seemed rehearsed rather than natural, pulled at memories of his own childhood. When adults forgot that children had needs beyond the material, when silence became a language all its own. "Where are your parents?" The words came out gentler than he intended, but the girl's shoulders still tensed. She looked up at him with those startling blue eyes, and Ben felt something shift in his chest. Not pity, recognition. "They're working," she said, the answer practiced and hollow. Her voice carried the careful pronunciations of expensive education, but underneath lay something raw and unguarded. She glanced at the sandwich in his hands, then quickly looked away, as if wanting something was shameful. Ben knelt down to her eye level, the way he did with Tommy when the world felt too big. "I'm Ben. What's your name?" The simple question seemed to catch her off guard, as if adults rarely asked for her thoughts rather than her compliance. "Rosie." She said it quietly, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to claim even that much space in the conversation. Her eyes drifted back to the sandwich, and Ben saw Tommy pushing off from the swing, ready to demand his lunch with all the subtle grace of a hungry 6-year-old. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Ben tore the sandwich in half, the peanut butter stretching between the pieces like a bridge. He handed Rosie the larger portion and watched her small hands cradle it with reverence that broke something inside him. She took a tiny bite, chewing slowly, as if trying to make the moment last as long as possible. Tommy appeared at Ben's elbow, sweaty from the swing set and ready to negotiate for more playground time. "Dad, who's the girl?" His question carried the innocent curiosity of childhood, unburdened by the social complexities that made adults whisper behind closed doors. "This is Rosie. She's sharing lunch with us today." Ben handed Tommy the remaining half sandwich, watching his son accept the reduced portion without complaint. Tommy had learned early that sometimes there wasn't enough, and sharing wasn't optional in the Carter household. Rosie looked between father and son with something like wonder, as if the concept of casual kindness was foreign to her daily experience. She took another careful bite, and Ben noticed the way she held the sandwich with both hands, protecting it from the autumn breeze that threatened to steal even this small comfort. The afternoon sun painted everything in golden light, but Ben couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at a child who lived in perpetual winter. The expensive dress, the careful posture, the practiced responses, they all added up to a picture he didn't want to examine too closely. Not yet. Tommy finished his sandwich and wiped his hands on his jeans with the casual efficiency of someone who had never questioned whether his next meal would appear. "Can Rosie play on the swings with me?" he asked, already reaching for her free hand with the unconscious generosity that still surprised Ben daily. Rosie looked to Ben for permission, another learned behavior that spoke volumes about her usual environment. He nodded and watched the careful mask slip just enough to reveal the 8-year-old underneath. She tucked the last bite of sandwich into her mouth and allowed Tommy to pull her toward the playground equipment. Ben settled back on the bench, the paper bag now empty, but somehow feeling lighter than when it was full. He watched Rosie follow Tommy's lead on the monkey bars, her expensive shoes sliding on the metal rungs designed for sneakers and childhood adventure. She laughed at something Tommy said, the sound bright and genuine, cutting through the careful composure like sunlight through storm clouds. The joggers had moved on, and the old man had finished feeding his pigeons. The park belonged to the three of them now, this unlikely group brought together by something as simple as shared hunger. Ben pulled out his phone to check the time and saw 3 missed calls from work. Cedar Falls hardware could survive without him for another hour. Some things mattered more than inventory reports and customer complaints. When Tommy called for him to push the merry-go-round, Ben joined them on the playground, his work boots crunching on the wood chips that cushioned childhood falls. Rosie sat across from Tommy, her small hands gripping the metal bars as Ben gave them a gentle spin. The late afternoon light caught in her hair, and for a moment she looked like any other child enjoying an ordinary day. But Ben noticed things. The way she checked her watch, a delicate gold piece that probably cost more than his monthly rent. How she straightened her dress when she thought no one was looking. The careful way she spoke, as if every word was being recorded for future judgment. These weren't the habits of a child who lived in chaos. These were the reflexes of someone who lived under constant scrutiny. The October air grew cooler as the sun dipped lower, painting long shadows across the playground. Ben called for last pushes on the swings, the universal parent signal that wrapped up unscheduled adventure. Tommy accepted the transition with minimal negotiation, but Rosie climbed down from the swing with obvious reluctance. "Do you need a ride home?" Ben asked as they walked back toward the parking area. It was a reasonable offer, the kind any responsible adult would make to a child alone in a public place. But something in Rosie's expression suggested the question was more complicated than it should be. "I can walk," she said, pointing toward the eastern edge of Cedar Falls, where the houses grew larger and the lot stretched toward the horizon. "It's not far." But her feet moved slowly, as if the prospect of returning home held no appeal. Ben looked at his watch. 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, and an 8-year-old girl was walking home alone from a public park. In Cedar Falls, that raised questions he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. Tommy climbed into his car seat with practiced efficiency, already planning tomorrow's playground adventures with the optimism that carried him through each day. But as Ben started the Honda and pulled away from Lincoln Park, he found himself watching the rearview mirror until Rosie's small figure disappeared around the corner of Elm Street. The drive home took 5 minutes, but Ben's mind lingered on blue eyes and expensive shoes, on the way hunger looked when it wore designer clothing. Cedar Falls was small enough that secrets had weight, and something about this afternoon felt like the beginning of a story he wasn't sure he was ready to read. At home, Ben heated up leftover macaroni and cheese while Tommy built elaborate structures with blocks on the kitchen floor. The domestic routine felt comfortable and worn, like his favorite pair of jeans. But underneath the familiar rhythm, questions circled like vultures. Who was Rosie? Why was she alone? And why did sharing one sandwich feel like he'd just changed the course of his carefully ordered life? Tommy's chatter about playground politics and swing set adventures filled the kitchen, but Ben found himself thinking about different conversations. About the careful way Rosie had accepted help, as if kindness came with strings attached. About the practiced answers that revealed nothing and everything at once. After dinner, when Tommy was absorbed in picture books and the dishwasher hummed its evening song, Ben found himself at the kitchen window looking east toward the part of Cedar Falls, where old money built houses like monuments to success. Somewhere in that direction, Rosie was probably sitting at a table larger than his entire kitchen, eating dinner alone, or with adults who measured conversation by productivity rather than connection. The thought followed him through Tommy's bedtime routine, through stories about brave knights and gentle dragons, through the careful ritual of tucked blankets and whispered prayers. Even after the house settled into evening quiet, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that today had been the first page of something much larger than a shared sandwich in a small-town park. Wednesday afternoon found Ben checking his watch every few minutes as closing time approached at Carter's Hardware. Tommy had art class after school, which meant Ben had an hour before pickup. An hour that his feet insisted on spending at Lincoln Park, though he told himself it was just for the fresh air and exercise his sedentary job didn't provide. The park looked different in the late afternoon light, longer shadows and cooler air that spoke of autumn's inevitable march toward winter. Ben walked the familiar path toward the playground, telling himself he wasn't looking for anyone in particular, just stretching his legs before the evening routine demanded his attention. She was there, same bench, same careful posture, but today she had a book in her lap and a pencil tucked behind her ear. Ben approached slowly, not wanting to startle her or make assumptions about unwanted company. "Good book?" he asked, settling on the far end of the bench with enough space to respect boundaries, but close enough for conversation. Rosie looked up, and her face brightened with recognition before careful composure took over. "It's math homework," she said, closing the workbook with obvious relief. "Third-grade multiplication tables." Ben nodded seriously. "Those can be tricky. Need any help?" It was an offer born from years of helping Tommy navigate homework battles, but Rosie's reaction suggested adult assistance wasn't always welcome in her experience. "My tutor says I need to figure it out myself," she said, the words carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. "Independence builds character." The phrase sounded memorized, like something she'd heard repeated until it became background noise. "Well, sometimes talking through problems helps," Ben said carefully. "Even if you're doing the work yourself." He pulled out his phone and showed her the calculator app. "Want to check your answers?" For the next 20 minutes, they worked through multiplication problems with the focused intensity of a study group. Rosie's pencil moved carefully across the page, and Ben offered encouragement without solutions. She was bright, catching patterns quickly once she understood the concept, but her approach was methodical in a way that suggested mistakes had consequences beyond red marks on paper. Tommy's art class ended at 4, which meant Ben needed to leave Lincoln Park by 3:45. But as he gathered his things and prepared to end this impromptu tutoring session, Rosie looked up with an expression that made his chest tight. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she asked, the question casual but the hope underneath anything but. Ben found himself nodding before he'd fully considered the implications. "Same time," he said. "Maybe bring some snacks." It was a small promise, but Rosie's smile suggested it carried the weight of something much larger. Thursday afternoon brought rain, the steady October drizzle that soaked through everything and made the park feel abandoned. Ben almost stayed at the hardware store, catching up on inventory and avoiding the weather. But something pulled him toward Lincoln Park anyway, umbrella in hand and thermos of hot chocolate warming his truck's cup holder. He found Rosie in the pavilion, a covered picnic area that provided shelter from the rain but little warmth. She was working on homework again, this time what looked like a book report, her small form hunched over the wooden table in concentration. "Rough weather for outdoor studying," Ben said, settling across from her with the thermos and 2 paper cups he'd grabbed from the hardware store's break room. "Indoor studying isn't always an option," Rosie said, accepting the hot chocolate with gratitude that made Ben wonder what her home situation really looked like. "The house is too big, too quiet." It was the first personal detail she'd offered without prompting, and Ben filed it away with the growing collection of puzzle pieces that made up this unusual friendship. Big house, expensive clothes, homework done in public places, careful answers that revealed nothing and everything. They spent the afternoon under the pavilion's metal roof, rain drumming overhead, while Rosie worked on her book report about Charlotte's Web. Ben listened to her read passages aloud, offering feedback that encouraged rather than corrected. She had good instincts about story and character, insights that surprised him with their depth. "What did you think of Charlotte's choice?" he asked, as they discussed the spider's sacrifice for Wilbur the pig. Rosie considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think she loved him," she said finally. "But I also think she was tired of being alone." The observation was astute and heartbreaking, carrying implications that had nothing to do with fictional farm animals. When the rain finally stopped and Tommy's pickup time approached, Ben walked Rosie to the park's eastern entrance. She moved in the direction of the larger homes with obvious reluctance, her small figure growing smaller as the distance between them increased. Friday brought sunshine and the kind of October afternoon that made Iowa feel like the center of the universe. Ben arrived at Lincoln Park to find Rosie already there, but today she wasn't alone. Tommy sat beside her on the bench, sharing animal crackers from his after-school snack, while explaining the complex social dynamics of first-grade recess. "Dad!" Tommy called when he spotted Ben approaching. "Rosie knows about playground politics too!" It was high praise from someone who considered recess the most important part of his academic experience. Ben settled into what was becoming his usual spot on the bench, watching his son and this mysterious girl navigate the easy friendship that seemed to come naturally to children. They shared crackers and stories with equal generosity, finding common ground in complaints about homework and dreams about weekend adventures. "Rosie doesn't have anyone to play with at home," Tommy announced with the casual cruelty of childhood honesty. "That's why she comes to the park." Rosie's cheeks flushed, but she didn't contradict Tommy's assessment. Instead, she focused on dividing the remaining crackers into precisely equal portions, her small hands steady despite the obvious embarrassment. "Well," Ben said carefully, "that's what parks are for, meeting new friends and sharing snacks." It was a diplomatic response that acknowledged the truth without making it sting. As the afternoon wore on, Ben found himself studying Rosie more carefully, the expensive clothes that spoke of resources beyond his imagination, the careful posture that suggested constant evaluation, the way she savored each cracker as if it might be her last. These details didn't add up to neglect in any traditional sense, but they painted a picture of abundance without nourishment, of material wealth that somehow left a child hungry. The weekend passed slowly, with no school to structure Tommy's schedule and no excuse for Ben to find himself at Lincoln Park. He told himself the restlessness was just autumn energy, the natural human urge to gather and prepare before winter's isolation. But Sunday afternoon found him driving past the park twice, looking for a small figure on a familiar bench. Monday brought routine and purpose, but also an unexpected visitor to Carter's Hardware. Ben was helping Mrs. Chen select hinges for her back gate when he noticed the expensive sedan idling outside his store. Black paint so perfect it looked like liquid, tinted windows that revealed nothing about the occupants inside. The driver emerged first, a tall man in a dark suit who surveyed Main Street with the careful attention of someone trained to notice threats. He opened the rear door with practiced efficiency, and James Morrison stepped onto the sidewalk of Cedar Falls like he owned every brick and board. Ben had never met Morrison in person, but everyone in Cedar Falls knew the silhouette. Morrison Industries had put their small town on the economic map, providing jobs and tax revenue that kept the community alive. Morrison himself was a figure of legend and speculation, the kind of wealth that existed in abstract terms rather than daily reality. Mrs. Chen followed Ben's gaze and whistled softly. "Big money coming to small-town hardware," she murmured. "That's either very good news or very bad news." Morrison entered the store with the confident stride of someone accustomed to deference. His suit probably cost more than Ben's monthly income, and his presence seemed to shrink the familiar space of Carter's Hardware into something smaller and shabbier. The driver remained outside, hands clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested military training. "Mr. Carter." Morrison's voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of being heard the first time he spoke. "I believe we need to discuss your recent interactions with my daughter." The words hit Ben like a physical blow, puzzle pieces clicking into place with terrible clarity. Blue eyes and expensive clothes, careful answers and practiced responses. The big house and quiet rooms that drove a child to seek company in public places. Rosie Morrison, daughter of the wealthiest man in 3 counties. And Ben had been sharing sandwiches with her like she was just another lonely kid who needed a friend. Mrs. Chen made a discreet exit, claiming sudden memory of an urgent appointment. The store fell quiet except for the old furnace cycling on and the distant hum of traffic on Main Street. Morrison stood in the center of the hardware store like a wolf in a sheep pen, perfectly groomed predator surrounded by honest tools and simple solutions. "I understand you've been feeding my daughter," Morrison said, the words carrying implications that made Ben's stomach clench. "Sharing meals, offering assistance with homework, spending unsupervised time with a minor child." Each phrase was delivered with legal precision, as if Morrison was building a case rather than having a conversation. Ben felt his defensive instincts rising, the protective anger that came from years of single parenting and small-town judgment. "She was hungry," Ben said simply. "Any decent person would have done the same thing." Morrison's smile held no warmth. "Mr. Carter, I appreciate your humanitarian instincts, but my daughter has access to the finest nutrition Cedar Falls can provide. She doesn't need charity from strangers." "Maybe not," Ben replied, feeling his temper rise. "But she needed kindness, and apparently that's been in short supply." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Morrison's carefully controlled expression flickered, revealing something raw and vulnerable before the mask slid back into place. For a moment, Ben saw past the expensive suit and corporate authority to the man underneath. A father who was drowning in his own success, watching his daughter slip away while he counted his victories in dollars and market share. My daughter's welfare is not your concern, Morrison said, but the words lacked conviction. I'm here to ask you to discontinue this friendship, for everyone's benefit. Ben looked out the store window toward Lincoln Park, invisible from this angle but present in his mind like a compass point. He thought about Rosie's careful smile and practiced answers, about the way she held a sandwich like it was made of gold, about Tommy's easy acceptance of a new friend and the simple joy of shared crackers on a sunny afternoon. She's 8 years old, Ben said quietly. She sits alone in a public park doing homework because her house is too big and too quiet. That's not a welfare issue, Mr. Morrison. That's a heartbreak issue. Morrison's composure cracked completely, revealing the desperate father underneath the corporate armor. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time since entering the store, he looked like a man carrying weight too heavy for any one person to bear. You think I don't know that? Morrison's voice broke on the words. You think I don't see her drawing pictures of other families? You think I don't hear her crying herself to sleep? The confession came out like a physical wound, years of accumulated guilt bleeding into the space between them. Ben felt his anger dissolve, replaced by something closer to recognition. Two fathers, different circumstances, same fundamental fear of failing the children they loved most. Morrison might have billions where Ben had hundreds, but money couldn't solve loneliness or buy the easy intimacy that made a house feel like home. Then why are you here? Ben asked, genuine curiosity replacing defensive hostility. Morrison ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, destroying the careful grooming in a gesture that made him look younger and more human. Because I don't know what else to do, he admitted. Because every choice I make seems to push her further away. Because a stranger showed my daughter more kindness in one afternoon than I've managed in 8 years. The honesty hung between them like a bridge. Neither man was sure they wanted to cross. Outside, Cedar Falls continued its daily routine, unaware that 2 of its residents were having the kind of conversation that changed everything or nothing, depending on what came next. Ben thought about the easy way Tommy had shared his crackers, about Rosie's gratitude for such simple generosity, about the loneliness that wore expensive clothes and the hunger that couldn't be satisfied by any amount of money. She doesn't need you to stop being successful, Ben said finally. She just needs you to stop being absent. Morrison looked up, and Ben saw hope fighting with skepticism in his expression. It's not that simple. My work, the company, the expectations, make time. Ben interrupted. Not perfect time, not scheduled time, just time. Show up at the park. Ask about her homework. Share a sandwich. The suggestion seemed to terrify Morrison more than any corporate merger or business crisis. The simplicity of human connection, unstructured and uncontrolled, was foreign territory for someone who measured success in quarterly reports and stock prices. I don't know how to talk to her, Morrison admitted, the confession barely audible. Every time I try, I say the wrong thing. She looks at me like I'm a stranger. Then be a stranger who cares, Ben said. Start there and figure out the rest as you go. Morrison left without making any promises, but something in his expression suggested the conversation would continue in ways that mattered more than words. Ben watched the expensive sedan disappear down Main Street, carrying Cedar Falls' most powerful resident back to a world where problems were solved with money and influence rather than presence and patience. That afternoon, Ben arrived at Lincoln Park to find Rosie's usual bench empty. Tommy expressed disappointment with the diplomatic skills of someone who had learned early that adult decisions didn't always make sense to 6-year-old logic. They played on the swings and fed ducks at the pond, but the afternoon felt incomplete without their third member. Tuesday brought more emptiness, and Wednesday stretched into Thursday without any sign of Rosie's small figure or careful smile. Ben told himself it was for the best, that Morrison was probably right about boundaries and appropriate relationships between adults and children, but the park felt hollow without her presence, like a song missing its melody. Friday afternoon shattered the week's pattern. Ben arrived at Lincoln Park to find chaos where calm usually reigned. Police cars with flashing lights, officers speaking into radios, worried parents gathering children with protective urgency. The familiar playground had become a crime scene, yellow tape creating boundaries that spoke of serious adult problems intruding on childhood innocence. Ben approached Officer Martinez, a high school classmate who had chosen law enforcement over hardware sales, but maintained the kind of small-town friendliness that made difficult conversations possible. "What happened here, Carlos?" Ben asked, watching paramedics pack equipment with the efficient calm that suggested emergency rather than tragedy. "Missing child," Martinez replied, keeping his voice low to avoid feeding the growing crowd of concerned parents. 8-year-old girl, disappeared from school during lunch recess. Last seen heading toward downtown. Ben's blood turned to ice water. "Rosie Morrison?" Martinez looked surprised. "You know her. Family's mobilizing half the county for the search. Morrison's got private security, state police, probably calling in federal favors as we speak." The world shifted sideways, familiar landmarks becoming surreal in the context of genuine crisis. Ben thought about Rosie's careful composure, her practiced answers, the way she held herself like someone carrying invisible weight. A child with resources beyond imagination, lost in a town small enough to walk across in 20 minutes. "Where would she go?" Ben asked, more to himself than to Martinez. "That's what we're trying to figure out. Rich kid, sheltered life, probably doesn't know the first thing about surviving on her own." Martinez paused, studying Ben's expression. "Unless, do you have any ideas?" Ben's mind raced through the fragments of information Rosie had shared during their park bench conversations. Big house? Too quiet? Homework done in public places? The careful way she rationed crackers and savored hot chocolate like it might be her last taste of kindness. "Have you checked Carter's hardware?" The words came out before Ben fully realized he was speaking. She mentioned liking the smell of sawdust and oil, said it reminded her of her grandfather. Martinez was already reaching for his radio. "All units, expand search to include Main Street businesses. Start with Carter's Hardware on the corner of 3rd and Main." The next hour passed in a blur of organized chaos. Search teams fanned out through Cedar Falls while helicopters circled overhead like mechanical buzzards. Ben found himself at the center of the operation, his casual friendship with Rosie Morrison suddenly transformed into crucial intelligence about the missing daughter of Iowa's most powerful family. Harrison, Morrison's personal assistant, interviewed Ben with the thoroughness of someone trained in crisis management. Where had they met? What had they discussed? Had Rosie mentioned any plans, any problems, any reason she might run away? Ben answered every question with growing frustration at his own limited knowledge. He knew Rosie liked art and struggled with math. He knew she was lonely and hungry for connection. But the deeper details of her life remained mysteries, protected by the careful walls children built around pain too large for their small frames to carry. The call came at 6:15, just as the October sun was painting long shadows across Lincoln Park's abandoned playground. Officer Martinez jogged toward Ben with relief written across his face in lines of exhaustion and professional satisfaction. "Found her," he called out. "She's safe. Scared, but safe." Ben felt his knees buckle with relief he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Where?" "Carter's Hardware, hiding in your stockroom behind the paint cans. Must have slipped in through the back door when you were dealing with the afternoon rush." The irony wasn't lost on Ben. While half of Cedar Falls searched for Rosie Morrison, she had been 20 feet from his usual workspace, surrounded by the familiar smells and sounds that had somehow become synonymous with safety in her 8-year-old understanding of the world. By the time Ben reached his store, the immediate crisis had dissolved into the complicated aftermath that followed every near disaster. Rosie sat on the floor behind his counter, small and overwhelmed, while paramedics checked her vital signs and social workers asked gentle questions about her decision to disappear. James Morrison knelt beside his daughter with the desperate relief of a man who had just glimpsed his own mortality. His perfect composure was completely destroyed, expensive suit wrinkled and tear-stained, corporate authority replaced by raw parental terror. "Why?" Morrison asked, his voice breaking on the single word. "Why did you run away?" Rosie looked up at her father with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. "I wasn't running away," she said quietly. "I was running to somewhere." The distinction mattered in ways that made every adult in the room reassess their assumptions about childhood motivations and family dynamics. Rosie hadn't fled from danger or abuse. She had sought out the one place in Cedar Falls where she felt genuinely welcome, where adult attention came without conditions or expectations. "To Ben's store?" Morrison asked, glancing at Ben with an expression that mixed gratitude and something that might have been envy. "To where people are kind without wanting anything back," Rosie said, the words carrying weight far beyond her years. "Where it smells like building things instead of just buying them." Morrison's face crumpled completely. Years of accumulated regret, finally finding expression in public breakdown. He pulled Rosie into his arms with desperate tenderness, holding her like she might disappear again if his grip loosened even slightly. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I've been trying so hard to give you everything that I forgot to give you me." Ben watched father and daughter navigate the first genuine moment of connection he had witnessed between them. Morrison's vulnerability was complete and devastating. The successful businessman reduced to a heartbroken parent who finally understood the difference between providing for a child and actually raising one. The crisis had cleared Carter's hardware of customers and curious onlookers, leaving Ben alone with the Morrison family while officials completed their paperwork and prepared to return Cedar Falls to its usual quiet routine. Harrison handled logistics with practiced efficiency, but even he seemed affected by the emotional weight of the afternoon's events. "Mr. Carter," Morrison said, standing slowly while keeping one hand on Rosie's shoulder. "I owe you more than I can possibly repay, not just for today, but for showing my daughter what kindness looks like." Ben shook his head, uncomfortable with gratitude that felt disproportionate to his simple actions. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," Morrison said firmly. "Anyone would have called social services or security or made it someone else's problem. You shared your lunch and asked about homework and treated her like she mattered. That's not anyone, Mr. Carter. That's exceptional." Rosie tugged on her father's sleeve with the urgency that preceded important 8-year-old announcements. "Daddy, can Ben and Tommy come to dinner? At our house? I want to show Tommy my art supplies." Morrison looked to Ben with an expression that mixed hope and uncertainty. The invitation represented territory neither man had navigated before, the intersection of different worlds brought together by a child's simple need for connection. "If Mr. Carter is willing," Morrison said carefully, "I think dinner would be a wonderful idea." Ben thought about Tommy, still at aftercare, and unaware that his park friend had become the center of a county-wide search operation. About the easy friendship that had developed between his son and Rosie, built on shared crackers and playground politics rather than social expectations or economic compatibility. "Tommy would like that," Ben said finally. "But just so you know, we're more pizza and paper plates than formal dining room." Morrison's smile was the first genuine expression Ben had seen from him. I think we could manage pizza. Harrison, could you call Tony's and have them deliver to the house? Extra cheese and whatever toppings an 8-year-old and 6-year-old might prefer. It was a small gesture, but it represented something larger. A billionaire CEO learning to accommodate the simple preferences of children rather than expecting them to adapt to adult sophistication. The beginning of a father putting his daughter's needs before his own comfort zone. That evening, Ben and Tommy sat in Morrison's dining room, a space larger than Ben's entire house, sharing pizza from paper plates, while Rosie gave Tommy a tour of art supplies that would have funded a small school's entire program. The formal table settings had been cleared away, replaced by the casual chaos that came with children and food and genuine laughter. Morrison had changed from his business suit into jeans and a sweater, the transformation making him look younger and more approachable. He asked Tommy about school and listened to Rosie explain her latest drawing project with the focused attention of someone learning a new language. "She's talented," Ben observed, watching Rosie demonstrate watercolor techniques with the patience of someone who had spent many hours alone with her art. "She gets that from her mother," Morrison said, then caught himself. Charlotte was an artist before she decided our life was too complicated for creativity. It was the first reference Ben had heard to Rosie's missing parent, and he filed the information away with the growing collection of puzzle pieces that made up the Morrison family story. Another loss, another absence that explained the careful way Rosie approached human connection. Tommy accepted Rosie's artistic instruction with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a new form of play. His attempts at watercolor flowers looked more like colorful accidents, but Rosie praised each effort with the generous spirit that came naturally to children when adults weren't teaching them to be competitive. As the evening wound down and Tommy began showing signs of approaching bedtime, Ben prepared to make polite exits and return to their familiar routine. But Morrison's next words stopped him mid-goodbye. "Would you consider making this a regular thing?" Morrison asked, the uncertainty in his voice at odds with his usual corporate confidence. "Dinner, I mean. Maybe once a week? Rosie has been happier these past few hours than I've seen her in months." Ben looked at his son, already planning their next artistic collaboration with Rosie, and at Morrison, whose vulnerability was still written clearly across his face. The offer represented more than shared meals. It was an invitation into the complicated territory of friendship across economic boundaries, of children leading adults toward connections that made no sense on paper, but felt exactly right in reality. "Thursday nights work for us," Ben said, watching Rosie's face light up with joy that made every potential complication worth navigating. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that surprised everyone with its naturalness. Thursday dinners at the Morrison house became the anchor point of both families' weeks, a scheduled intersection of different worlds that somehow created space for authentic connection. Morrison proved surprisingly adaptable to child-centered chaos, learning to appreciate Tommy's endless questions and Rosie's detailed explanations of artistic technique. He started leaving work earlier on Thursdays, arriving home in time to help set up art projects or listen to playground politics with the same attention he once reserved for board meetings. Ben watched the transformation with fascination and growing respect. Morrison's adjustment wasn't seamless, but his commitment was absolute. He asked for advice about homework help and birthday party planning with the humility of someone who recognized his own limitations without being defeated by them. "She's teaching me as much as I'm teaching her," Morrison confided one Thursday evening as they watched the children collaborate on a mural for Rosie's bedroom wall. "I never realized how much I missed by trying to provide everything except presents." The friendship between families deepened through small shared experiences. Tommy's soccer games where Morrison cheered as loudly as Ben. Rosie's school art show where both fathers stood proud and slightly overwhelmed by the complexity of elementary school social dynamics. Harrison, initially skeptical of the arrangement, became an unexpected ally in maintaining the balance between Morrison's business obligations and his commitment to Thursday night dinners. He scheduled around the protected time and handled crisis calls with instructions that emergencies requiring Morrison's personal attention were limited to genuine disasters. The transformation in Rosie was the most remarkable change of all. Her careful composure softened into genuine childhood spontaneity. She started bringing friends from school to Thursday dinners, confident that the Morrison house had become the kind of place where children were welcome to be loud and messy and completely themselves. Ben's hardware store became an unofficial afternoon destination for Rosie and Tommy, who discovered that building things with their hands satisfied something deeper than any store-bought entertainment. Morrison sometimes joined them after work, trading his expensive suits for work clothes and learning basic carpentry skills alongside the children. "I never understood the appeal of manual labor," Morrison admitted one afternoon as they sanded boards for Tommy's new bookshelf. "But there's something satisfying about creating something useful with your own hands." Ben nodded, watching Morrison discover the simple pleasure of physical work that produced tangible results. Different kind of success story, more immediate feedback than quarterly reports. The seasonal rhythm of Cedar Falls provided structure for their growing friendship. Halloween brought elaborate costume planning sessions. Thanksgiving expanded to include both families, with Ben contributing his grandmother's stuffing recipe and Morrison learning to carve turkey with YouTube instruction videos. Winter deepened the bonds through indoor projects and shared hot chocolate on Thursday evenings that stretched later as the children grew more comfortable with extended bedtimes and adult conversation that included their perspectives rather than talking around them. By the time spring arrived, Ben realized that their unusual friendship had become one of the most important relationships in his life. Morrison's presence filled a gap he hadn't recognized in his own experience of single parenthood, providing backup during Tommy's difficult moments and shared celebration during his triumphs. "You've given me something I didn't know I was missing," Ben told Morrison one April evening as they watched the children hunt for Easter eggs in the Morrisons' extensive backyard. Morrison looked surprised. "I thought it was the other way around. You've been the teacher in this relationship." "Maybe at first," Ben said. "But somewhere along the way, this became mutual. Tommy's benefited as much from your presence as Rosie has from ours." It was true in ways that had taken Ben months to fully appreciate. Morrison's influence had expanded Tommy's understanding of possibility and achievement, while Ben's grounded perspective had provided Morrison with practical wisdom about the daily challenges of parenting. The children, oblivious to the adult complexities that had brought their families together, simply accepted the blended reality as their new normal. Thursday dinners, weekend projects, shared holidays, all became part of a family structure that made sense to them in ways that transcended economic boundaries or social expectations. As summer approached and the first anniversary of their meeting at Lincoln Park drew near, Ben found himself reflecting on the chain of small choices that had led to this expansion of love and connection. A shared sandwich had become the foundation for a friendship that enriched all their lives in ways none of them could have predicted. The park bench where it all began had become a regular stop during their family walks, a place where Rosie and Tommy played, while Ben and Morrison talked about parenting challenges and business decisions with equal weight given to both topics. The spot had transformed from a location of lonely hunger into a symbol of how simple kindness could reshape entire families. One warm June evening, as they sat on that familiar bench watching the children play, Morrison turned to Ben with an expression that mixed gratitude and wonder. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Morrison asked. "If you hadn't been at the park that day, or if you hadn't been willing to share your lunch?" Ben considered the question seriously. "I think about it sometimes, but mostly I'm grateful it happened exactly the way it did. Some stories are worth the risk. Morrison nodded, watching Rosie teach Tommy a complicated playground game that involved rules only children could understand. She talks about that first day sometimes, says it was the day she learned that kindness doesn't always come with conditions attached. The observation carried weight that made Ben appreciate the true significance of their first encounter. What he had seen as a simple response to childhood hunger had been Rosie's introduction to unconditional generosity, the foundation that allowed her to trust in the possibility of genuine connection. As the evening light painted everything golden, Ben realized that their story was far from over. The friendship that had begun with a shared sandwich had evolved into something that would shape all their futures in ways they were still discovering. Thursday dinners and weekend projects were just the beginning of a relationship that had taught them all new ways to be family. The little girl who had once sat alone on a park bench, hungry for more than food, now ran across the playground with the confident joy of someone who knew she was loved without conditions. And the fathers who had found each other through their children's friendship had learned that the most valuable gifts couldn't be purchased or earned. They could only be shared.